Okay, good afternoon or early good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's public lecture. Before we kick off, I'd just like to say it's absolutely fantastic to welcome you all and see so many people in what is our first fully in-person programme events for quite some time. Can we ask that you turn your phones to silent or turn them off if they're not already? I should also say we're not expecting a fire alarm or a fire test. So if the alarm sounds, please follow instructions from the event stewards and they will make sure that you get out, and we'll find our way to the car park outside for the marshalling point. Those of you who are tweeters, please feel free to tweet about tonight's event using the hashtag InsightsNCL. And I'd also like to say that following the lecture, there'll be an opportunity to ask the speaker some questions. So tonight is the Jack Jeffery lecture, delivered today by Dr. Katy Roelich from the University of Leeds. She's going to talk about people-powered, what if people, not technology, are the answer to the climate crisis. The Jack Jeffery lecture was set up by a very generous donation from Jack Jeffery, who passed away in 2017. He was a Newcastle University alumnus and a chair of convocation. He has a long and illustrious career in the water sector, where he was formerly the chair of the Water Companies Association and well-known for his work on improving water quality, especially in the River Wear, where his technique of using bacteria to break down industrial effluents led to significantly improved water quality there, and of course transferring that around the world. He was passionate about sustainability and wanted to communicate the message and importance of sustainability as far and widely as possible and make it engaging for everyone. And that's why he set up a fund to allow us to put on this annual lecture. Today's is the fifth in that series. We previously had talks from Jonathan Porritt and Sir Liam Donaldson, but today we welcome Dr. Katy Roelich from the University of Leeds. Katy is Associate Professor there and Co-Director of the Sustainability Research Institute. She actually followed a very sort of similar, I think, career trajectory to Jack Jeffery, with a degree in chemistry, and then sensibly came to Newcastle to study environmental engineering, before moving into industry for a number of years, and then back to Leeds, where she did a PhD in the social sciences. I had the pleasure of meeting Katy a number of years ago, and she was doing some really fascinating and groundbreaking work, looking at the use of rare elements in our infrastructure and different ways of delivering and financing infrastructure services. It was no surprise to hear a few years ago that she was awarded a prestigious fellowship from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And she's using this to examine how we drive rapid, sustainable, but also fair social transformations, so we can avoid environmental breakdowns without exacerbating existing inequalities. Katy, welcome to Newcastle again. Thank you very much for coming.
Just bear with me while I faff with my laptop a minute. But thank you very much for that introduction. You've actually stolen a march on me, because when I was looking at what I'd talk about for this, I did a bit of checking up on what Jack did, and I also saw the remarkable symmetries in where we'd come from. And the sort of progression from a very sort of physical science through to more social science is something I saw in Jack Jeffery's work as well, and something that I really wanted to pick up on today. So having looked at Jack's latter work around kind of socialism and humanism and his interest in sort of global sustainability transformations, I really hope that he would be pleased about what I'm talking about today, because I want to focus more specifically on the role of people in a sustainable future. And the work I've been doing over the past 10 years while I've been in academia, because I worked in a very similar field to Jack for 10 years, based in Newcastle for much of that, looking at how to sort of clean up environmental problems and how to remedy and remediate pollution and contamination. And then sort of the trajectory took me to, well, why are we cleaning up? Why is this happening in the first place? So let's see if we can stop this pollution happening. And then thinking about transformation and change and how that needs to happen, but really about the role of people in that. So I'm going to focus much more on people here, and this is based on several projects I've been working on. I was thinking about the best way to tell you about it, because it's sometimes quite abstract, sometimes quite technical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the necessary transformation in the energy system, but I'm going to tell it through several stories of the people that I've been researching over the time. So I'm hoping to convince you that those people are just as important as the technologies that they're interacting with. I'm hoping to convince you that we really need to think about the impact of transitions on people. So I'm going to tell you a series of stories, and they all have a sort of a story of hope element to them, of the sort of the hope that people can give in the transformation, but also a cautionary tale of things that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about the climate crisis and the transformation that needs to happen, what we need to be thinking about in terms of people. So I'm going to be aided in this by some illustrations, because every good story should have had good pictures as well. And these are illustrations done by a very talented friend called Richard Smith, who's also a storyteller. And I'll give details of Richard and his work as we come to the end of the talk. But let's begin. Let's start with the story. So I'm going to start with sort of, I guess, the author's note before our short stories of people begin. And this is what you normally see when we're thinking about energy transition. So if we come from the position that we need to drastically reduce our carbon emissions, I'm just going to take that as an assumption that we all agree with in this lecture theatre. We need to transform our energy systems to achieve that reduction in emissions. And these are the things that we need to do. We need to sort of drastically reduce the amount of oil, stop exploration, reduce the amount of oil that we're extracting. Sort of number one in our transformation that needs to happen. We need to think about some things. We might need to capture emissions. We might need to use large generating facilities. We might need to use things like nuclear power to generate a chunk of energy. So there's still some energy technologies on a large scale that we need around capturing some emissions, around generating from creating hydrogen, or from generating from nuclear power. We need to drastically ramp up our renewable energy technology from wind, solar, hydro, tidal, and there's work there. And we probably need storage associated with that to balance out variability. We need to use energy much more efficiently, and we need to insulate homes and buildings a lot better than we do now. And when we travel, we need to be using more public transport, more active transport, so we're cycling and walking. And if we do need to use private cars, they should be electric. So that's generally how the technologies of the energy system change, are presented, but there's something missing from that slide, which is people. People are required to actually make that change happen. That's one part of what I'm going to talk about. And also people are impacted by those changes. So bringing in new technologies or expecting people to do different things has impact on people. And it's not always a positive way. So I want to raise the profile of people in the transformation by telling some stories. And they all have quite strong morals to those stories. So part story of hope, part cautionary tale. So let's go to our first story. And our first story is about, it's based in the oil and gas sector. Just going to set the scene. So despite the current government's best efforts, oil exploration does need to stop. We need to wind down it as a sector quite urgently. Now, that's one aspiration, but we have to remember that this sector has been a part of the UK's heritage. think about our long-standing history, particularly here in the northeast with mining. We've got entire cities built around oil and gas. If you think about in Aberdeen, about 10% of the workforce there work directly in the oil and gas sector, so a huge part of our history and our workforce are based in the oil and gas sector, so shutting it down is not a straightforward thing. And there's a lot of our economic situation is actually supporting the oil and gas sector, so all the services that support oil and gas, all the other jobs sort of around the oil and gas sector, so it's a big, complex sector. And let's transport ourselves to Aberdeen then, as that's a sort of real sector of oil and gas. It's a thriving place. There's lots of activity. It's very buoyant. House cost prices are very high. It's a great place to live and work. There's premium wages in there in the sector. It's not a very easy place to work. Quite often you end up in remote places like this. It's quite disruptive. But they're highly skilled, experienced people. So we have a very buoyant sector. We have people with a lot of skills and very dedicated to that cause. So enter KIRSTEN here. And KIRSTEN's worked in the oil and gas sector for about 10 years. And so she's incredibly proud of all that she's done in that. She's very technically skilled. She's got a huge amount of education and lots of qualifications to be able to work there. And she loves her job because, it's an enjoyable job. People work in this sector. And she's seen a lot of sort of protests, the sort of Just Stop Oil, she had Extinction Rebellion protests, and so she sort of has a sense that it's not a great thing to be in the oil and gas sector, but it's quite upsetting, it's targeting the company she works for. So deep down, she knows that the sector can't last forever. She knows that there's probably not going to be a job for life in there, but she's invested a lot of effort to be where she is, and retraining she's heard about, but it's quite expensive, and she's really trying to save for a house at the moment in that very expensive city of Aberdeen. So she's quite unsettled, but she's not going to move because it's difficult. She's got pride in her job. She's got limited resources with which to retrain and move. So it's not really a priority for her right now. And that's the reality for a lot of people working in the oil and gas sector. We know it's long term, it needs to stop, but there's not an urgency necessarily to move. But here's the plot twist. So KIRSTEN's just started being involved in a citizens' jury. Now, for those who don't know about them, it's a deliberative process where members of the public are selected to come and discuss a really complex issue, like they're being increasingly used for climate change, and issues like that where it's not black and white, there's complexities, there's realities of people's lives, and we come and they hear evidence about a particular topic, they deliberate on that, and then they make recommendations to a particular group of people about what needs to be done. And so KIRSTEN's gone to the citizens' jury, and this is where I met KIRSTEN, just to say these are not people's real names. They're definitely aggregations of people I've met, but I did meet KIRSTEN at a citizens' jury held in Aberdeen to talk about how Aberdeen could address the climate crisis, what could be done there. And the process of hearing evidence from different people, and she was hearing evidence from people from the oil and gas sector, but also people from advocacy organisations and activists about the challenges, and trying to rationalise all that information and giving the chance to just debate and discuss has been revolutionary for KIRSTEN. And to be able to think about recommendations that would actually help her do something like get training, like have certainty about when to move, has been a really sort of life-changing experience for her. And because of the nature of the situation in Aberdeen, a lot of the recommendations from the climate jury are about supporting retraining, about certainty of trajectories for sectors and planning and helping move out. And so as a result of being on that jury, not only are amazing recommendations made, but KIRSTEN decides to actually retrain. So she takes the money that she's been saving for a deposit on a house, probably is quite a good idea about now, and actually decides to retrain. She starts at an MSc to completely change sector. So the jury's been fantastic to give her the chances to explore and identify the kind of help she'd need to move, and really have helped done that. So the moral of the story here, so the story of hope is that there is a possibility through people taking action of changing work to actually contribute to something that seems just like massive and intangible, like avoiding oil extraction, and actually making change when they have control over that. But also, the key role for protest there is that Kirsten wouldn't have necessarily known these things that were happening if she hadn't known about the Extinction Rebellion protests, about Just Oil protests. And also, if she hadn't had a space in which to try and take those differing views and discuss and debate them, like a citizens' jury, she might not have had a chance to really understand the multiple perspectives. So she's in a very difficult situation in a sector where they really feel like they're being hammered and there's no alternative, but the ability to debate and rationalise that was being incredibly important to identify where she had agency. So that was really crucial there. But the cautionary tale is that change does need to happen rapidly. So the kind of change that she is making, she's been able to make because of her circumstances, need to be done in a very well-supported way. So people need support to be able to move. We need planned support to be able to move. And we have to really think about the kind of like, these sectors are rooted in national identity, they're rooted in personal identity, they're rooted in people's hard work of having built them up there. So we need to think about the enormous investment, both into personally and in terms of skills that's needed to actually move between sectors like that. So a real sort of cautionary tale there. So just to recap, we have got choices in the work we do and in how we live our lives, and we can actually reduce reliance on oil and gas through those choices, but they need to be supported, is the key caveat to that. And another sort of like a story of hope is that citizens' jury is a way to debate complex issues, define those points of agency, a really crucial way of debating some of these complex issues. So they are not black and white. But we need to think that in an energy transition, work will change dramatically. And these are more than just jobs. These are people's investments. They're sort of, we have industrial heritage here and identity. So change isn't straightforward. So we need to understand the complexity of change and put in place support in terms of retraining and in terms of planning to actually enable these changes to happen. So lots of richness to Kirsten's story there. So to another complicated part of the energy system, I'm going to talk about large generation technologies here. So again, it sounds simple to say we need to stop extracting oil and gas. It's sort of similarly simple to say we need to build carbon capture and storage, or we need to set up hydrogen. But the reality is that those kind of very large technologies are an enormous investments with very high stakes and really significant consequences if they don't work out as expected, or even if decisions do it, but not in the timescales anticipated. So there's a real sort of like, well, we know this needs to happen, why aren't people doing it? But the complexity is such that for the government, which is a complex organisation in and of itself, to actually make decisions, it's really hard to know what decisions to make. So when we say we need CCS, it's much more complex than that. And it's very hard to see, well, we're going to invest in it, that's a good thing. But if you invest in something like carbon capture and storage, it actually might have impacts. It might sort of build our reliance on fossil fuels. It might mean that we're actually, if we just take the carbon out of the air, it might mean we just keep going with fossil fuels, and that's not what we need to be doing. So there are unintended consequences of just building some carbon capture and storage, for example. So we're even around something that seems seemingly quite simple, it's very difficult to get things to happen. So our protagonist in this story is Georgina, and she's a civil servant based in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And you can tell from that title already that she's got a lot of competing objectives to deal with. And Georgina's been tasked with analysing whether the government should back a very controversial technology. And she's already struggling. You can see she's really not having a great day at work. And it's complicated by the fact that her minister has already made a statement supporting the technology before any sort of analysis or decision has been made. And so she really feels pressure to follow that line. So, you know, decisions are not politically neutral. Inherently, there's a political element that we're not making rational decisions. They're quite value-laden and politically informed. So she's already struggling to do this. Another challenge is, so here she is sat at her computer trying to look at lots of bits of evidence. And quite often, decision makers try and use computer models to help sort of project what might happen with various situations, to think about how to bring different forms of evidence together to try and support a decision. But in this situation, the system she's trying to look at is too complicated. We don't have the models to do that. So the sort of default position of just what does the model tell me isn't working for her. And there's no connections between things. And quite often the processes that people are expected to follow are very much based on the cost of the technology, and there's the sort of benefits in terms of some quite narrow outcomes. And for this technology, there's lots of social impacts. It sort of has really significant impacts for people. And the processes you're trying to use just aren't able to take those things into account. And she's working with lots of different people because it's such a big technology affecting so many different parts of the system. It's interacting with lots of different people, and they're giving us lots of different bits of evidence. It's really, really conflicting, and it's not clear at all how it lines up. So here she is with her sort of computer and her spreadsheets, just really lost in a mire. And she tries to gather as much evidence as she can, but it's just using existing processes and it's just not working for her. So fortunately, she's found a new piece of government guidance, which was written in sort of based on evidence that was developed out of a project that I worked on with colleagues here in Newcastle and in Leeds, that looked at how we take the sort of the social impacts and the complexity of systems and the sort of systemic effects into account when we're making decisions. And it's not been used much before, it's very new, it's untested, and so it's taking her a lot longer than is normally expected, but she's trying to do that. And she's trying to sort of draw together lots of different teams within government to do that. So I think the key here is that when people are making decisions, there's people making decisions, and it's very complex systems. So we need to think, I think there's a lot of pressure, so why aren't we just doing this? Why can't we just make a decision about this? But decision making itself is a very social process. People are making decisions, and we have bounded rationality. We can only deal with so much information. The systems are very complex. It's very hard to tie these things together. And so often it can be very difficult to see what should be happening. But we are getting new approaches. A lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is thinking about how do people make decisions? How can we bring in these more sort of complex systems and make decisions under really deep uncertainty? And then really help people through this decision-making process. So, you know, simply saying, why aren't we doing things isn't helping. So I say our morals here are that people are recognising how complex energy systems are and trying to use different approaches that are taking into account the impacts on people, the complexity of the system, and building in flexibility. So if we're making a decision saying, well, if this doesn't work, what do we do next? What do we do after that? So not just saying, well, let's just build this and then nothing else. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So trying to build in that flexibility. But the reality is that making decisions is very hard, and it's very hard to understand the impact of a set of interventions. And just really assuming that decision makers are stupid or avoidant or not doing things is really not helping. So when we're thinking about these things, we need to think about the people actually making decisions. So moving away from large generation technologies into sort of renewable technologies, and we need renewables, so like wind, solar, hydro, tidal power are going to become increasingly important. And that might be through sort of larger facilities like all the offshore wind we're seeing off the east coast. It might be through large tidal surge schemes like the ones that are being developed around sort of north of Scotland, Wales and the southwest. But also there's a role for smaller scale projects, not developed by the private sector and developed by communities. And the promise of these community energy projects is that they will provide benefits for the community, not just the energy system. So this gentleman hugging the wind turbine here is Fred. And Fred is a retired engineer, And he has got lots of time and lots of skills. And to be honest, he's really struggling without a focus for his analytical brain. So he's just desperate to direct that energy somewhere. I've met a lot of Freds when working with community energy. And he absolutely would love to build a renewable energy project in his community. So the community would own the wind turbine, they would generate energy, the energy would power their community hub. They could use it to reduce, they would sell the energy back to the grid, they could use that to invest in facilities in the community. He's got an idea for sort of like a little training school so he could get apprentices to come and work on with the wind turbine and work in the sort of business functions and sort of build the skills of the community, and also things that really bring people together. So it'll actually be that sort of cohesion that Mike really feels he's been lacking in his community of late. And so what they want to do is they want to sell shares to fund it. So then any profit that does come out of the community energy project is given back to the community. So they're just benefiting in all sorts of different ways. And this idea of sort of getting people to volunteer or work as a form of getting people together is really important to him. So, I mean, that sounds like a real story of hope, doesn't it? Why aren't we doing this everywhere? Well, one reason is it's horrendously complicated from a policy, a sort of regulation perspective to get these things set up, and it takes the likes of Fred, who have a lot of spare time, to navigate through a really complex, difficult system. So there are only so many Freds in the world to do this, so that's one element. But the other aspect is Emma, who you might have noticed lurking on the right of this slide, and you might have noticed that she's not so sold on the idea as Fred. And Emma would really love to get involved in the scheme. She's very concerned about climate change. She's also really struggling to pay her energy bills. And she'd really like to get involved, but she can't make meetings or volunteer because she works shifts, she works in a low-paid job, and so she can't actually afford to buy the shares either. So one of the people who is probably the most likely person to benefit from the scheme is not able to because she can't get her voice heard through meetings or through being a shareholder, and she can't benefit through the uptick in the shares. So there's a real worry from Emma's perspective that the scheme couldn't not actually unite the community, but could actually divide it by the people who are able to contribute and the people who aren't. So there's real concern from her perspective. So the moral of the story here is that community energy, we've got a long history of working with community energy projects in the UK, and they have been able to deliver fantastic outcomes by providing new sources of renewable energy. Quite often there's less objection to them because they're smaller scale, there's more involvement in the community, so that they're more likely to get planning. And there's real benefits to the community in terms of income and skills and cohesion. But just because it's community action doesn't mean it's democratic. It doesn't mean that automatically everyone benefits, and we really need to take heed and make clear that there is potential for people to excluded just by the nature of it. So real need to be cautious around things like that. Okay, so we're moving away from energy generation, and we're moving away from the UK here. So we're going to relocate to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and more specifically to a cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you'll see there that Joseph is having a dream about an electric vehicle. And electric vehicles need batteries. And cobalt is a mineral that's used in lithium-ion batteries. And you might know that the UK has a target to move away from sales of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. And unless people are going to stop buying cars completely, that means there's going to be a massive surge in sales of electric vehicles. So we can have some hybrid vehicles, but mostly it'll be electric vehicles by then. So there'll be a dramatic increase in electric vehicle usage. And we're seeing that already. We're seeing a surge in purchase of electric vehicles. I think this is partly as they move out of the territory of being a hair shirt, of being a sort of a clunky short-range electric vehicle into a real luxury option. But there's been a real surge in purchasing of electric vehicles. So from a cumulative number of 100,000 electric vehicles in 2019, there's currently around about 570,000 electric vehicles in the UK. So, as a proportion of electric vehicle sales, it's not massive, but it's surging. So we can expect that to surge more, particularly as we get nearer the target of 2030, where there's no more new petrol and diesel vehicles sold. Which means there's going to be a surge in demand for cobalt to go into the batteries, because they haven't yet worked out how to recycle the cobalt from lithium-ion batteries. And cobalt is only found in a few places in the world. Quite often these reserves are in quite unstable countries. And one of the places where cobalt is mined is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hence, that's why we've relocated here. So our story here is about Joseph, and this is Joseph here. He's working in an unregulated cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so he works very long hours, he works very dangerous conditions, and he constantly worries about his mine flooding or collapsing because it's unregulated, it's not very well protected. And actually, that's very similar to the conditions we used to have for coal mining in this country, so it's not a case that's a million miles away from where we are. I know George Orwell wrote a really powerful piece on when we're using energy, thinking about where the energy came from. So this is when we're buying electric vehicles, thinking about where that might have come from. Joseph's already got quite a bad cough from the dust in the mine, again, very similar to coal mining sector here. But he's too scared to go to the doctor about it, even if he could afford to, because he doesn't want that linking to the mine. He knows that the effluent from the mine is polluting the very important nature reserve where the mine is located, again, very similar to situations in the UK. But he doesn't really know what to do about it because he needs to earn money so that his children can get educated so they don't end up going and working in this mine as well. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, his family live in Kinshasa, which is, a major city near the mine, and the air quality there is terrible, partly because of the petrol and diesel vehicles and all the traffic situations there. It's already causing his children respiratory problems, so he's sort of got a double whammy, because most people in Kinshasa don't have a cat in hell's chance of owning an electric vehicle to replace a diesel vehicle, so they're sort of suffering from the mining, but they're also suffering from not being able to deal with air quality issues there. So the morals of this story is there's a glimmer of hope, is that we are seeing an acceleration in electric vehicle uptake, and that's great. That we are seeing our diesel vehicles replaced and moving away from fossil fuels in the transport sector a little bit. But really thinking about the cautionary tale is we need to think about the impact our decarbonisation has on people in other parts of the supply chain of the world, quite often in more vulnerable situations, and the ability of everybody to be able to access those solutions. So not everyone has access to resources that would allow them to buy an electric vehicle, not even in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the UK as well. So we need to be careful of these broad brush solutions that aren't accessible to a lot of people. So our next transport story is thinking about an alternative to the private car. So if we didn't all buy electric vehicles, what else could we do? And the alternative to that is public transport, or to cycle or walk, what we quite often call active travel, where we're basically using our own propulsion to move. And even after the pandemic, there's been a real sort of surge in journeys using active travel. So walking in particular has increased from 25% of journeys were done by walking before pandemic to somewhere near 40 now, actually. So the habits we've picked up in the pandemic, where we couldn't use public transport, or we didn't want to, or we were doing things more locally, have continued. And that's fantastic. And around about 45% of journeys are less than 2 miles. So there's scope to actually increase the proportion of journeys done by walking further. Further, 40% of journeys between 2 and 10 miles. So for a lot of us, that's quite accessible by cycling, depending if we live somewhere safe to do that, obviously, and we have the ability to do that. But that's nearly 80% of journeys that are of a reasonable distance, taking into account those constraints, that could be done by some sort of form of active travel. So there is an opportunity to do that. So active travel really represents a real story of hope. For not just for decarbonisation, because active travel is actually very good for us. So it's very good for fitness and health, both mental and physical health. So there's lots of reasons why active travel is a real story of hope. And the improvement in air quality of having fewer cars on the road is another story of hope as well. So poor air quality, predominantly from petrol and diesel vehicles, it causes huge respiratory problems and heart problems and actually sort of brain problems in smaller children as well. So there's a real story of hope of active travel reducing air quality problems as well. So public transport hasn't fared quite so well during the pandemic. There's actually been quite a significant drop in public transport, but if we could find ways to get people safely back into public transport, that's another similar story of hope, is it's a much more efficient way to move around from a climate perspective. But we can't assume those benefits available to all. So again, going back to this sort of let's just checking assumptions about active travel and public transport being available to all. And the star of our story here, and I must admit that these are my favourite. And I met Brian and Maisie when I was doing a series of interviews to try and understand people's attitudes to climate action and what stopped people taking action on the climate. And Brian was a fairly typical example, quite an extreme example, but a fairly typical example. But Brian's retired and he's currently caring for his grandchildren and caring for his son who's struggling with mental health problems. And they all really struggled through the pandemic restrictions. So his main priority is the well-being of his children and grandchildren. So that's his sort of main priority. He is concerned about the climate. He's very concerned particularly about the impact on his grandchildren. But right now, his concern is their well-being. And this delightful child is his granddaughter, that's Maisie, and she loves all things to do with horses. So the main highlight of her week is to go horse riding every week. And the thing with horse riding stables is they're usually quite far away from city centres. There's not many buses that go past there. So there isn't a public transport option to get to the riding school. It's too far to cycle. It's not safe enough to cycle, particularly with a small child. And Brian's not a particularly confident cyclist either. So active travel isn't possible. So Brian has to drive Maisie every week to her riding lesson. But at the moment, he thinks that's a valid option for him. He's thought about getting an electric vehicle, but it's out of his price range. He lives on a terrace. He's got nowhere to charge it. The infrastructure just isn't there for him. So that's not an option, really. So Brian's quite comfortable with his choice about this because it's meeting his priorities. But the city where he lives has decided to become a car-free city and has started sending out a lot of leaflets raising concerns about the difference between people's concern about climate change and their willingness to act about it. And they're sort of presenting statistics about how many people want to take climate action but aren't taking climate action. And he's sort of the inference is that they're not doing enough or they're not trying hard enough. And that's really upset Brian because he is concerned, but he's got more pressing concerns right now. And he's asked his council to improve the bus service, but they've just said it's not financially viable right now. So he's a bit stuck. And it's causing him a lot of stress and upset, which is really, really frustrating for him. So the moral of the story here is that we do have really viable alternatives to private car travel, which are better for emissions, they're better for air quality, they're better for health, but they're not available to everyone. And the gap between people's concern about climate change and their ability to take action is caused by a whole complex range of things to do with their sort of resources, their relationships, and their priorities. And so it's not a simple case of lack of knowledge or a resistance to action. It's a whole complex range of things. So we need to be really careful not to stigmatise people for not acting and actually find ways to make action easier. So the focus on the individual is less helpful in cases where it should be focused on individual and making it easy for them to act within a system. So sort of a strong cautionary tale there. And then our final story, and this is perhaps the most important part of the piece, is reducing demand for energy. And reducing demand is the most effective way to reduce emissions, because if you're not generating energy, there's no emissions going to either sort of burning fossil fuel, but also into making the technology to create the energy or to transport it, to lose it. So reducing demand for electricity, for gas, or for transport is the most effective way to do that. There's a lot of research evidence in that it's the most cost-effective way to do that. Lots of benefits economically to doing that. So it's, there's industry reducing their energy demand, and that's sort of down to sort of typical business processes, but individuals reducing their energy demand in their home or transport is subject to the sort of same challenges that Brian is facing. So it's a very important thing to do. It's something that's very sort of clearly under our gift to do, but it can be a real thing where we can contribute, but we need to think about the impact on actual people's lives. And this is not from work that I've done. This is from work from my colleague Lucy Middlemiss, who's done a lot on fuel poverty. And one of the main challenges around demand reduction is quite often people are automatically reducing their own demand because they can't afford energy or they can't actually heat their homes. And we're seeing the cost of living crisis is becoming an increasing problem. And so, sending a message to reduce demand at the same time as people are already doing that and already actually underusing energy is a real challenge. And I've included a link to Lucy's work in the last slide, and I really encourage you to look more about it. She's writing a lot of really important stuff about fuel poverty and the need to think about particular groups of people. And this, our last story this is Shaquille. So he was an IT professional, had a very well-paid job, but his marriage recently broke down and he's developed a long-term health issue, means he can't actually work anymore. So he lives in a beautiful old terrace, but it's seen better days, it's not very well insulated, it gets very cold and damp. And I think Shaquille thinks that's probably one of the sort of factors that's exacerbating his long-term health issue. He tends to be at home most of the day because he doesn't want to go out and people to know that he's not working, and he doesn't have a lot of friends to go and socialise with, so he's spending a lot of time in his home. And he can't really afford to heat his home, even though he spends a lot of time in there because it's so leaky, and he certainly can't afford to insulate it, even though it's sold to him as a bit of a no-brainer. So while he was applying for his personal independence payment, he got behind with his energy payments. So he's on a prepayment meter, which means for every unit of energy he actually pays more than someone who's on a standard meter. And he's really struggling. So he recently got a letter from his energy company saying that he was eligible for a new boiler, and some new windows, but he doesn't really know if it's genuine. He doesn't really have anyone that he can ask about that. And so he's stuck. He can't afford energy, but he can't afford to retrofit his home. He can't even afford to access the grants that are available to him because he doesn't have the capacity or the support to do that. So there can be really, really complex issues as to why people can't reduce demand. There's really complex issues as to why people can't afford energy. And again, sort of blanket messages about reducing demand as making a contribution to climate change can be really problematic. And again, it's really important to understand an individual's circumstances and context when dealing with these issues. And again, even when offering support to people, so offering a free boiler, if people don't have the support to work out if that's a good thing or they can't cope with the disruption, it's not a straightforward solution. So the moral of the story here is that there is a real story of hope that reducing demand, and particularly in the home of transport, is probably the most effective way to reduce emissions, but that some people lack the capability to put measures in place that would allow them to do that. They don't have the financial or the sort of ability to make decisions to keep them at home more comfortable. So new forms of support and different forms of support might be needed. So those are our stories that have come from the research. But what would I say are the overarching morals that have come from those? Just before we go to question, I just want to reflect on those morals a bit more. In terms of the sort of stories of hope, there are many, and the particular role of people in this is that we do, as individuals, have choice in the work we do and in how we live our life that can reduce reliance on oil and gas, which can encourage the uptake of renewable technologies. So things like using public transport, buying electric vehicles. There'll be a cautionary tale associated with that. With proper support, we can make those choices, not completely in isolation of support, of the right supporting infrastructure. I think we are starting to recognise that the energy system is very complex and that change is not as straightforward as we think it is, and it will take time. It'll take acting in lots of different places. But we're finding really new ways to take into account uncertainty and complexity when we're making that change. And we're finding ways of involving the public in that decision making. Importantly, it's, you know, this is affecting people so much that we should be taking into account people's perspectives. So through ways like building in flexibility or using citizens' juries to really make that more democratic, more flexible approach to change. Some of the solutions to the climate crisis have real benefits for, you know, community cohesion, for air quality, for health. So things like active travel and community energy. There's real tangible benefits beyond just the climate crisis that we need to be thinking of. And just really thinking about reducing demand is probably the most effective way to reduce emissions. And again, that's quite often within the gift of people to do something about. So lots of stories of hope about the role of people in transition. But that always comes with cautions, particularly when people are impacted or people there's burden put on people to act. You know, work will change. In terms of new sectors, old sectors dying out, we need to support people to change in work, and we need to sort of build that in a planned way to allow people to do that. There's a lot of potential for exploitation. We've seen with the history in the UK of entire mining communities losing work, of losing livelihoods, of losing identities. If it is poorly managed, we can't have that happen again. There needs to be support around work, particularly people's livelihoods and identities around that. We can't just assume that these things are easy to do and it's just a resistance for people doing it. There's complexities in doing that. We absolutely need to push people to make decisions, but we need to understand there are constraints in how people make decisions too. There's real opportunity for community action around a lot of these things, around doing things as a community, but we just need to make clear that just because something is community-based doesn't mean it's democratic. So we need to find ways that sort of avoid exclusion of people if things are done through community approaches. We need to think about people in other parts of the supply chain. As if we buy something new, where does that come from? What are the impacts down the supply chain? Sometimes not buying something is more effective than buying something that's more sustainable. Quite an important message across the piece there, but particularly around when we've got metals that come from vulnerable or unstable countries where there is less control over the conditions of the people involved in extracting that. And again, we've got historical lessons in the UK from that, from the exploitation of coal mining, and you know, the fantastic industrial growth we've seen at the cost of large portions of society. And then thinking about action as individuals, there's a lot that explains that gap between concern about climate and action, which is, might be someone's personal circumstances, it might be the infrastructure available to them, and we need to think about how we fill that gap or what's in that gap without just condemning people for not acting. And that some people just lack the capabilities in terms of resources or ability to act, to put measures in place. So it's all about understanding why people aren't able to act and building support and action to do that. So these will be, I don't know if slides are circulated, but the video definitely is. So these are the people that I want to say thank you. So Richard Smith did the illustrations. He's actually an author, but he does amazing illustrations as well. And he's got a website with lots of amazing books and stories, particularly around nature, if people want to have a look at his work. And then my colleague, Professor Lucy Middlemas, who work on fuel poverty, she's doing a lot, there's a lot in the news, and she's doing a lot in the news about our fuel poverty. So do look at Lucy's work as well. So hopefully there's some positives to take away about the possibilities of people and the sort of really important role people have in the energy transition, but hopefully some points to reflect on as well about the possibility for there to be sort of maladaptation or people to have negative consequences of some of the changes, and those things really need to be taken into account. So hopefully we've left plenty of time for questions. Thank you.